Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another biology lecture. Today, we're going to be looking at the cycling of matter through nature. And we've got a very simple diagram here. We've got carbon dioxide in our atmosphere and carbon dioxide as carbon in living things. And there's a cycle involved here, and we're going to look at it. So, good stuff. The focus question for today is, how does matter flow through an ecosystem? Now, understand that this is matter, not energy or carbon, which we've already kind of looked at a little bit. So this is going to include things other than matter, or other than energy. The vocabulary for today, this is actually a review vocabulary, is matter, nutrient, biogeochemical cycle. It's a pretty complicated one there. Nitrogen fixation and denitrification. So a cycle is hopefully a review vocabulary for you. And a cycle is any kind of repetitive process that begins at one point, moves to two or other points, and then returns to the initial state it begins with. Okay, or a series of steps or processes that occur and then return. And so you can think of it as just kind of a big circle in some respect, because the end point is the beginning point. So matter, hopefully you remember this, is anything that has mass and occupies space. And so it can be a bunch of different things. But when we're talking about biology and we're talking about living things, matter is usually thought of as things like nutrients or carbon. Carbon is not a nutrient, it is the backbone and building block, or the building substance of all life. Nutrients are pretty much everything else, every other element that works with carbon to produce living plants, living systems. An amendment to that, hydrogen, carbon and hydrogen, are the primary substances. You might also include oxygen in that list, but other things like phosphorus and nitrogen, these are all nutrients. Sulfur is another molecule or element that shows up in living things that would be considered a nutrient because it's not the major building block of the molecule. And so that brings us to the concept of biogeochemical cycles. And bio meaning living, geo meaning including the earth itself, chemical meaning some kind of element or some kind, or compound, and cycle meaning that it moves in and out of living systems. Okay, and so we'll look at several examples here. The first of which is one we've already kind of mentioned before, very briefly, and that's the water cycle. Water has the chemical formula H2O, meaning that it has two hydrogens and one oxygen. And water in nature is stored in reservoirs, that's what they're called, as of either liquid water or gaseous water in the atmosphere. Now, in living things, it's going to be the major place where chemical reactions take place within your cells. So if I look down at one of my skin cells, in the middle, there are some structures, but the structures are floating in is essentially a type of water. It's called cytoplasm, and its primary constituent is H2O. And if you think about it, every time you use the restroom and go pee, you are excreting water that has a bunch of dissolved things in it. So you have to continually drink water, and therefore the water goes into you as an organism and becomes part of your living system. And then when it carries out the waste and is excreted through sweat or through urine, the water then becomes non-living. It's out of the living system and is therefore part of nature itself again, returns to an abiotic factor, or becomes an abiotic factor again. Whereas while it's inside of you, being used by your body, it could be thought of as a part of your biology, a part of your system. And so the carbon and oxygen cycle are both related through two processes. One is photosynthesis that takes carbon out of the atmosphere, and the other is cellular respiration, which releases carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So photosynthesis in, carbon dioxide in, oxygen out, that's photosynthesis, that's carbon fixation. And then cellular respiration is oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. And so those are two antagonistic processes. They work in opposite directions to one another, and they cycle. And your carbon has a short cycle, which is carbon dioxide's in the atmosphere, photosynthesis into biological systems, into you, and exhaled back out when it's used to extract the energy. But carbon also has a long cycle, which is a storage in oil or coal or natural gas. If it becomes a dead carcass, becomes buried and then fossilized or converted into a long-term form of carbon storage. Now, nitrogen is an important nutrient to plants in particular. Nitrogen, and I would also include phosphorus here, but the book doesn't mention it, because it's essential for photosynthesis. That's the taking of carbon dioxide and sunlight to make sugars and store energy. Okay, and so the process of taking nitrogen out of the air, which is its main reservoir, something like 70% of the Earth's atmosphere is actually into gas, nitrogen gas, is known as nitrogen fixation. And nitrogen fixation is done by bacteria that live in the roots of a type of plant called a legume, beans, types of bean plants, and little nodules where these bacteria live, and they have a very symbiotic relationship. And so the bacteria live inside this plant, and they take atmospheric nitrogen and make it into organic forms of nitrogen. And then the plant takes that nitrogen and produces chlorophyll with it. Now, at the other extreme end of the nitrogen cycle, after it's been taken up by consumers and secondary consumers from its producers, is denitrification, the return of nitrogen to the atmosphere as nitrogen to gas. And that's done by bacteria or fungi that will break down the nitrogen-rich molecules and produce nitrogen into gas and release it out into the atmosphere. Okay, the book does actually talk about the phosphorus cycle, which I'm very happy about, because this is another really important nutrient for photosynthesis. And phosphorus is stored primarily in rocks. Okay, so it's originally stored during the process of sedimentation as plants and organic materials break down and are covered, and it's stored in rock. And as wind and rain erode rock, phosphorus is then released into rivers and streams, and then plants or animals that drink this water move it into the living systems. And an animal that drinks this phosphorus-rich water runs inland, urinates, and now some phosphorus has been spread internally into the environment. A plant grows, and an animal eats it, and now that phosphorus is in the feces of that animal, and as it runs along and drops it, phosphorus is then released into the broader environment as a whole. There are some fungi that live within or in symbiosis with plant roots that can extract phosphorus directly from the soil as it kind of digests the environment around it through the secretion of various enzymes. But most phosphorus is released into the environment through erosion of rocks and then subsequent distribution by rain and water as it flows towards a lake, river, or eventually the ocean. So, how does matter travel or flow through an ecosystem? Well, hopefully I've given you several different ways that this happens, and you can answer this question pretty well for yourself. If not, of course, do please ask me questions. You know I love questions, and I thank you very much for listening.